much, Nassim, and thank you to the organization for hosting this and for having me, and for hosting at a really critical moment, because we do know in Egypt there has been a history of an uptick in death sentences and executions during the month of Ramadan, especially towards the end of the month. And we need to talk about the strategic use of timing in terms of mass death sentences, but also executions at the moment to chill political activity or what could potentially be social activity towards the end of the month and going into the summer. So there's an importance of timing here, and I appreciate this coming together today, because we can anticipate, based on what we've seen in the past few years, executions coming in the next couple of weeks. But if we take a step back and look at Egypt in the past 9 years, if we look at the political landscape and we look at social and at the civil landscape, we know today there are between 60 and 80,000 political prisoners. The regime has had to build between 16 and 23 new prisons to handle the overflow. Amnesty International once called Egypt, after the Arab Spring, that this was Generation Protest, the youth who took to the streets. Now they're known as Generation Jail. We know that immediately after, there were about 830 cases per year of torture that were recorded. And when we talk about recorded, we can only estimate or fathom to estimate what the actual numbers are. Police systematically torture detainees with impunity. Prisons are referred to as cycles of hell. 1,250 people were disappeared in the past couple of months in the basements of jails, about whom there is no information. There have been at least 240 political activists who were arrested and tortured for online posts. Mass unfair trials targeting protesters, journalists, human rights workers are routine. Sweeping death sentences, the closures of NGOs and civil society organizations, the freezing of their assets, attacks on press freedoms, including 18 journalists who are still in prison, the blocking of 434 websites to filter content on Egypt. References of judges to disciplinary hearings who agree to even attend workshops on human rights. There have been at least 20,000 civilians tried in military courts, 150 of them children. There's no real adjudication of the law. The extension of the emergency laws of 1958 allows unchecked power up to the security forces to arrest and detain, and allows the government to impose censorship and to force evictions. So looking at this backdrop, how do we understand what's happening today in terms of mass executions or death sentences? There have been at least 521 executions that we know of. And according to figures, this could be even more than that, because we are not counting here extrajudicial killings that happen often, not just of prisoners, but of those who are seen as a threat to the state under the expansive terrorism law. The primary legal framework that Egypt is based on is the 1937 Penal Code, which establishes two methods of execution: hanging for civilians and firing squads for soldiers. It was the formation of the Terrorism Court in 2013, when President Sisi took office, that laid the ground, or after the military coup, that laid the groundwork for the rapid expansion of the use of the death penalty in recent years. Amendments to the Penal Code related to terrorism charges soon followed and were approved by the government in 2014, and they expanded the concept of terrorism and changed the punishment for terrorism crimes from life in prison to the death penalty. Now, we need to understand what this means in terms of what is under the terrorism law. Defaming the state falls under the terrorism law. If you have between 4,000 or 5,000 Twitter followers, you are seen as a social media influencer, a news outlet, if you will. And so if you say something outside of the state narrative, you can be held and tried under the terrorism law and even be liable to these sentences. And so we think about what's ultimately happening. It's this deep chilling effect that's occurring today in Egypt, and the weaponization of sentences and executions has led to an even deeper chilling effect. The scores of executions are, more than anything else, a product of the ruthless effort of the security establishment to reshape Egypt's political and social spheres according to the government's own autocratic vision. The government has almost uniformly co-opted the judicial system. The constitution and fundamental laws have been amended, and new laws have been introduced to circumvent due process guarantees or remove them altogether. Egyptian authorities have appointed special judges to these terrorism courts, and they've issued several hundred death sentences. They don't shy away from making clear that where they stand politically, denigrating all opposition, praising the army and the security forces. The government also introduced amendments in 2017 to undermine the independence of the top appeals court, a once highly respected institution. The government has instrumentalized the judiciary to imprison and execute political dissidents and to aggressively raise the cost for dissidents, sending the message that criticizing or opposing the government can literally cost people their lives. When we think about what this is leading to in Egypt, these trials that lead to death sentences and executions, we all know are now sham trials, accusing, for example, 90 people for the death of a single individual, and then without due process, trying them and calling for their execution. There are individuals who are being tried in cases where they were actually in prison when the crime was committed. And so these sham trials are resulting in an impunity of execution, an impunity of silencing. The culture and the state of fear that has been created in Egypt is unlike anything we've seen in the past. And so when we think about what this ultimately is leading to, it's leading to a moment where, those of us who've been studying the Middle East and democratization throughout the world and trends and rise of populism and hyper-nationalism, in the 2000s, when we would talk about Egypt and democratization, the major stressors points were, well, we need to push for political pluralism and political engagement and more voices at the table and more secure elections. Today, we're talking about stopping killing people with impunity. So the entire narrative on democratization throughout the world is no longer about good governance, transparency, human rights, accountability. It is simply about not killing with impunity. And it's not just Egypt. This trend is moving throughout the world. We talked about waves of democratization. We now know that there are waves of authoritarianism, Egypt being number 3 on the mass execution list. And so the trend is not just in Egypt. And so I think when we think about this in terms of foreign policy, international community, and interests, there needs to be a deeper conversation on where security comes from, where international security is going to come from, because several countries in the world that were historically seen as pillars of stability, for example, in the Middle East, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, the fact that they're becoming more and more repressive in the long term will lead to not just greater instability, but will lead to countries that are going to have domino effects of instability throughout the region, and ultimately will force countries like the United States to rethink the strategy in the Middle East, but it might be too late. And so from a strategic point of view, understanding what happens when countries are fundamentally not just allowed, but almost given a blank check to remain authoritarian, to increase their impunity of cracking down on their populations, the narrative then of democratization and human rights will continue to fall on fewer and fewer ears. What we did see in 2011 was that the masses came to the streets believing that change came through democracy. Today, when the West supports authoritarian leaders, the fear is what is going to be the alternative? What will people see as the mechanism of freedom and justice? Is it going to be democracy, an integrated international community, when many in the region believe that the international community has turned its back on true democratization and human rights? Thank you.